As I've heard that the second dose of vaccines has stronger side effects than the first. If true, why is this? I know we touched on it a little bit. Do you think what we mentioned was sufficient, or there's some other things that you would like to mention? I think Katie, you touched on that the first time. Would you like to kind of describe why again?
Yeah. So I think I said before, it's you're kind of amplifying this response, right? So even though you have an initial immune response to the first dose, the second one is what really amplifies it and gives you the full protection. So that's why you tend to see more side effects after the second dose. Something I actually don't know, and maybe Chris and Tom, you guys can talk about this, because I know there's, Pfizer and Moderna are doing this 2-dose schedule. Johnson Johnson is 1 dose. And, I think it was interesting kind of, when that gets decided, right? Because you have to fix some of these things, when you do the dosing, how many doses, that has to be fixed kind of before you move to these large, like, phase 3 type trials. So I don't actually know, how much of that is empirically decided early on and then, or kind of, it just worked out that way. And that it seems to be because, Pfizer and Moderna have really good, efficacy, but then I think Johnson Johnson's a little lower. So is that because it's only 1 dose? I don't know if you guys have thoughts about that.
Yeah, so there's a funny story about this that kind of gives a clue as to how these things work out. So there's a fourth vaccine that's been approved in other countries, the AstraZeneca vaccine, right? That hasn't been approved in the United States yet. And the funny story of the AstraZeneca vaccine was they set up a dosing schedule, right? And the plan was to try 2 things. It was going to try 2 standard doses or a high dose followed by a standard dose. I'm pretty sure that was the plan. Mm-hmm. But there were two dosing regimens. One where you got the same dose twice, and one where you got a different dose at the first one. Mm-hmm. And what ended up happening was, through kind of a paperwork error and clerical error, a bunch of people in Britain got the wrong first dose. So they, instead of getting the same, they were supposed to be in the double same dose, right? So they're supposed to get, 50 milligrams on the first day, 50 milligrams on their second dose. But instead, they got a low first dose and a high second dose, a low and a standard, right? So it wasn't the plan to test this. It just sort of happened through some paperwork errors. And then ironically, what happened was, when the data came out, so AstraZeneca came forward and they said, look, we tracked down this paperwork thing. We didn't plan to have the second dose group. We never planned to do this. Mm-hmm. But that dose group had the best efficacy. So the totally random mystery dose group, it wasn't a mystery, they knew what they got, but the totally unexpected random dose group was the protective one, mm-hmm. Which happens surprisingly often in science. The thing I didn't know I was doing is the thing that works. But so part of the reason that this ties into what Katie was saying is the other countries have taken this data and they have approved the vaccine, right? And the United States FDA said, you weren't planning on doing that. So, right, it's sort of like a court system where it's like, sorry, can't look at it, right? You didn't plan to do that, so we can't consider it, right? It's data from the poisonous tree. And so instead, what AstraZeneca is doing is that they've set up a new phase 3 trial where they're going to test officially the dose, the new dosing regimen that they accidentally developed along the way. And so then they will get that approved. That will eventually be approved. I looked up some scheduling. It kind of suggests that kind of April, May is when that one will probably make its way through the FDA process. But so they ended up getting a setback because they sort of guessed on the dose, and it wasn't what they designed in their trial. So when you design a clinical trial, you do have a plan, right? You have a planned dose schedule. But somewhere along the lines, the companies made a judgment call, which was, Moderna said, look, we want to make sure we get the best efficacy out of this deal. This is what I imagine happened in I don't know what happened in their boardroom, but I imagine what happened in their advisory board meetings was, listen, if this thing doesn't work, we're not going to get approved. So take the conservative approach, dose people twice, prime boost. They probably had some mouse models that suggested they could get better efficacy out of 2 doses or a better immune response. That I know they had done some monkey clinical trials as well. And so they probably had some internal data that if they gave people, or if they gave monkeys 2 doses, that they got a better protection than if they gave them 1 dose. And so they committed to the 2-dose schedule, right? And then they tried it, and then they stuck with it, because if you start to fiddle with it, much like getting a mortgage, if you start to fiddle with what you were doing, the bank gets uncomfortable. If you start to fiddle with the clinical trial protocol, the FDA gets uncomfortable, and they tell you like, whoa, like we don't like what's going on here. So a good example of that along the Moderna Pfizer vaccines is that I think it was maybe a week or two ago, the New England Journal of Medicine published an update on these vaccines. And what they did was they went back through and they found people who fell off the vaccine schedule, right? And they selected specifically patients who only got 1 dose and asked if they were protected, right? Because we never tested 1, we just tested 2, and then it worked.
Yeah.
And then if it's not broke, don't fix it, right? And it turns out that if you get a single dose, you're, from those kind of smaller studies, you're anywhere from 80 to 90% protected, right? But now we're sort of committed, right? So to get the FDA to move, it's probably not going to happen, right? Unless you're going to do another trial with 1 dose and see what happens there. And I just don't think there's a lot of push or a lot of interest in developing that. But yeah, it's an interesting question. So it's a little bit of both. The company has an idea when they go in. And then if they want to modify that idea, they sort of have to go back to the start. So if it works, they're very hesitant to touch it because, if it worked the first time and now you spend a whole bunch of money on a second clinical trial and it didn't work, what'd you do, right? Like you just wasted a bunch of money and you didn't get anything out of it, right? Like you're not getting goodwill points for a failed clinical trial. Nobody's going, yay, thanks Moderna for checking that out. So there's not a lot of incentive.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's just from the original question, you're just amplifying the second, and that's why it's just stronger.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. I didn't want to stop you, Chris, because that was all really good information. For sure. All right.